Welcome everyone to this exciting interview with Dr. Janet Khan and Professor Hoda Mahmoudi. We're here talking about their new book called A World Without War, Abdu'l and the Discourse for Global Peace. Janet Khan is joining me from Brisbane, Australia. She's a former member of the research department at the Baha'i World Center in Haifa, Israel. After completing a doctorate in counseling at the University of Michigan, she held academic positions at the University of Michigan and the University of Queensland and Brisbane, Australia. Her research interests include gender issues, the role of women in religion, aspects of social change, and the evolution of the Baha'i system of administration. Her previous books are Prophet's Daughter, The Life and Legacy of Bahia Khanum, Outstanding Heroine of the Baha'i Faith. And we're also joined by Professor Hoda Mahmoudi in Washington, D.C. Professor Mahmoudi has held the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland, College Park, since 2012. As director of this academic program, Professor Mahmoudi collaborates with a wide range of scholars, researchers, and practitioners to advance interdisciplinary analysis and open discourse on global peace. She studies structural racism, women and peace, frontiers of globalization and governance, and challenges in the globalization of the environment. So tell us all who don't know, what is the book about?
Our book, A World Without War, Abdu'l's Discourse for Global Peace, takes a fresh look at the phenomena of war and peace. And it invites the reader to view peace as more than just an end, a cessation of hostilities, but to examine aspects that are important to laying the foundation for a sustainable peace, leading to a culture that's characterized by a collective state of being, manifesting unity. Now, to do this, we describe in some detail the unique contribution of Abdu'l, who's the son of Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, to the discourse on global peace through his travels, his writings, and many other aspects of his life. And to highlight the significance of his contribution, we set the book in the context of the years leading up to the First World War, which were very interesting, because by looking at what was happening in the world and looking at the life and contribution of Abdu'l, I think we gain a deeper understanding of the significance. The publication of the book was timed to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the delivery of two very important and detailed letters on peace that Abdu'l wrote to a peace group at The Hague. And these letters have come to be known as the tablets to The Hague. And I'm sure there'll be much more discussion of this as we continue our conversations today.
Great. So Hoda, please tell us a little bit about Abdu'l, just for some of those who might not know that much about Abdu'l. Could you tell us a little bit about Abdu'l and in relation to this, the context of this book?
Abdu'l is a very unique person, not only in religious history, but I think in history altogether. Although he's less known at this point, I think as time passes, he will become much more known in all circles. He is the oldest son of the Prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah. And he, for Baha'is, because of the station that his father gave him when he passed in his will and testament, Abdu'l is the person who, after the passing of his father, became the head of the Baha'i religion. And he's also referred to as the center of the covenant, meaning that in his role, he was able to keep the religion, which relates very much to peace, to keep the religion together. And from there on out, to create this system of covenant, a unique system that the Baha'i faith has that preserves the religion as a single religion and prevents it from becoming divided into sects or into fractions. His knowledge, although he was really never schooled, because most of his life the family was in exile from country to country, he has very keen knowledge about just every aspect of human existence, of the creation of this world, the universe. And so for Baha'is, his knowledge and his understanding of the spiritual realm as it relates to the physical or material realm is very important.
So maybe tell me a little bit more about these letters and the context around the letters.
The letters came into existence because it's a long story, and I'll try to start it off and then Janet can tell you more. But there's an organization at The Hague at the time that was very interested in examining the concept of peace and how the nations might come together to try to talk together and collaborate and see if they can find a peaceful solution to their conflicts. So the letters were written in the early 1900s, and I'm going to now turn it over to Janet to talk about how these letters came into being.
As Hoda has mentioned, there was activity, there was a lot of interest in peace in the years following. It began following the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, because that led to the system of alliances which dominated the political scene really right up until the end of the First World War. And as part of the search for ways to stop war, a number of meetings took place, especially in Europe, in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And from it, there was a group that was concerned about arbitration and was concerned about establishing rules and regulations in relation to the conduct of war. And two of these meetings, one that was held in 1899 and the other one in 1907, were called by the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Nicholas, for the purpose of consulting about military spending, reductions in military spending, and other aspects of the conduct of war. These meetings were interesting. They were international, but they had no teeth in the sense of being able to really implement the conventions and the treaties that were established. But nobody would. It was such an important issue that nobody was really prepared to give it up. So they were thinking that there should be another meeting in 1915 in order to continue this process, and maybe from that some kind of international, more permanent body would be established. The war intervened. It broke out in 1914, and so it was not possible to hold the kind of meeting that was anticipated in 1915. So a group of pacifists, especially those in the Netherlands and Switzerland, didn't want to let it go. They felt that you couldn't wait. Peace was so pressing. So they convened a meeting of whomever could come, and it included people on both sides of the conflict of World War I. And they established a temporary body called the Central Committee for a Durable Peace. And this body had its headquarters at The Hague. And what this body was interested in doing was not finding a way to immediately end the First World War, but to promoting international dialogue and discourse about principles and kinds of activities that would need to take place in order to create a sustainable peace when the First World War would come to an end. And so to do this, promote these ideas, they created an executive committee which had its headquarters at The Hague. And it sent out the manifesto that had been prepared and also the ideas, and called for ideas to be sent to this committee so that they could be collated and given to the peacemaking body at the end of the war. And part of this involved sending the material, the manifesto, to all the countries in the world and to newspapers throughout the world. And as a result of that, a story was published in a newspaper in Tehran. I think that the newspaper was called Roznameh Iran. And it was read by a very alert 24-year-old young Baha'i man who looked at it and thought, gosh, this is really interesting. Some of the ideas that this group is expressing in its manifesto really resonate with what the Baha'i teachings about peace had to say. And he noticed also that they were calling for new ideas. Anybody who wanted to make an input, this was a chance. So he was very excited, and he turned to a couple of other sort of well-versed and quite prominent Baha'is in Tehran. One was a hand of the cause of God, Ibn Astagh, and the other was a man by the name of Ibrahim Piruzbakhsh, who was a physician and had a high position in the military, and heaven knows only what. We don't have a great deal of information about him. The three got together and consulted and decided to write to the executive committee and share with them their understanding of the Baha'i view of peace, and also to encourage them, if they wanted more information, to write to Abdu'l Baha. This was 1915. In 1915, and for several years during the First World War, communications, especially mail and cable, mail was cut off from the Holy Land. And so it became evident that the only way to really communicate with Abdu'l Baha was to write to the Baha'is in Tehran and have them forward the letter to Abdu'l Baha. This communication between the group of Baha'is in Tehran and the body at The Hague continued for several years, which I think is really interesting. And it was all during the period of the war. And it wasn't until the war ceased in 1918 that communications opened up again with the Holy Land. So it wasn't until the end of 1918, early 1919, that they were able to communicate with Abdu'l Baha and tell him what had been going on. And so as a result of that, two of them were invited, Ibn Astagh, the hand of the cause, And the young man, whose name I've neglected to mention, his name was Ahmad Yazdani. These two were invited to go to the Holy Land for consultations, and Abdu'l-Baha, being informed about the interest of this group, sat down and wrote a long letter, a detailed letter on peace to this executive committee of the Central Organization for a Durable Peace at The Hague. And this was the end of 1919. The letter was translated and hand-carried by these two Persian Baha'is to The Hague and presented to the group. And just sort of quickly, when they got there, they had great difficulty finding the office of the organization, because with the end of the war, the organization had kind of largely dissolved. And so you can imagine their surprise when two gentlemen from the East turned up in The Hague, bringing a letter from the head of the Baha'i faith on the subject of peace that was written in response to letters that the organization had written in 1915.
Right.
And,
was that some kind of, do you think, was that an impetus or a catalyst for things to start up again or rev up again, the dialogue amongst that organization? Do you know?
No. The time, I think, of that organization had passed.
Mm-hmm.
It was, by then, the League of Nations was in the final stages of its establishment. Some of the ideas that they'd been developing were incorporated into the thinking of the peacemakers. But I think, to me, the really interesting thing is that irrespective of what had happened to this organization, this communication between the organization and Abdu'l-Baha and his response to their letters and his encouragement of their work in the area of peace, it provided an avenue for the writing of a letter which, though written to a specific organization in 1919 and a second letter in early 1920, these letters have historical importance and their content are critical to the whole subject of peace. So it was like something that opened a door to make possible the sharing of this perspective on peace.
And what were some of those things? What were some of the, key points in that letter?
Hoda, why don't you pick up with this? I've been talking too much.
Well, the letter basically starts out by saying how happy Abdu'l-Baha is with the endeavors of this organization. And then he says, if you talk about peace, if you ask anyone whether they would like peace to happen today, I mean, not in those words exactly, anyone would say, yes, we would like to have peace in the world. But he said, saying this is just not enough. Indeed, what needs to happen is that conscience needs to be raised. Greater understanding needs to come about in order to grasp really the magnitude, the complexity of what it takes to even contemplate a world at peace. So Abdu'l-Baha's letter is in no way utopian. In fact, I would say it's quite the opposite. It's very realistic and very much addressing major social issues that form a barrier to global peace. So then he says, we need to raise human consciousness about peace. And the way to do that is then he begins to examine what are the problems, what are the barriers. And I don't want to go for too long, but he then outlines these, which are predominantly the principles found in the Baha'i faith, including with how on an individual level, Baha'is are actually forbidden to engage in conflict and contention. They are not to harm another person, whether verbally abusing them or physically. They are not to bring sadness. In fact, that's the word that Baha'u'llah's tablet talks, not to sadden other people. In other words, Abdu'l-Baha describes his father's teachings in these ways, that it begins with the individual. How does the individual live a life that promotes peace, if you will, within the family, within the neighborhood, etc., etc. Then he describes the prejudices that are very much problematic, because these prejudices always lead to some form of conflict or war. And he lists them as political prejudice, patriotic prejudice, economic prejudice, class prejudice, racial prejudice, religious prejudice. And he says, as long as these prejudices continue, as long as we don't investigate the truth and not just imitate the past, we will continue to repeat the past in relation to the conflicts that we have formulated over our history. And therefore, he talks about how important it is that through the arts and sciences, we begin to discover means to develop a better society for everyone, and to find the means through spiritual education as well as secular knowledge, in order to be able to eliminate these barriers to global peace. So it's a very, as I said, it's not utopian. When you read it, at the end, you say, my God, there's so much work to do here.
Do we know how the tablet was received? Do we know if it was like well received, or to what extent? Was it just kind of like, oh, great, thank you? Or
I think the organization thought that Abdu'l-Baha was trying to teach them the Baha'i faith in a sense of, wanting to have them understand how important this religion is, which is fine. I mean, that wasn't his intention, but that's what this organization at first thought. But how they received it, I think, was cordial, that we appreciate your sending this to us, and we are very happy that you've explained all these principles to us. But it was sort of too late in a sense, because, the war had ended and other things were happening.
One of the things that we constantly hear, I mean, a lot of individuals think that war is just a part of human existence. Conflict and contention, war, it's just the way the world is. It'll never, we'll never see peace. And it's kind of a lot of people actually genuinely believe that. Even I think people who strive for peace also believe that, well, it's a part of human nature. We are kind of innately, imbued with conflict and contention or negativity. So war will always be a part of our history as a human race. Is there anything about that in the letter, or what are your thoughts on this concept?
I guess what I see in the tablet, especially the second tablet, in the discussion of prejudice, Abdu'l-Baha links a prejudice to the causes of war. And he's very specific. I've just got it in front of me, this particular passage. It says, in every period, war has been waged in one country or another. and that war was due either to religious prejudice, racial prejudice, political prejudice, or patriotic prejudice. It has therefore been ascertained and proved that all prejudices are destructive of the human edifice. And then he goes along and says, so long as these prejudices persist, the struggle for existence must remain dominant and bloodthirstiness and rapacity continue. Therefore, even as was the case in the past, the world of humanity cannot be saved from the darkness of nature and cannot attain illumination except through the abandonment of prejudices and the acquisition of the morals of the kingdom. So what I get from that is that there's a definite connection between war, the causes of war, and prejudice, and that this is likely to be a continuing issue because human perfection doesn't automatically happen. Mm-hmm. And so there'll always be a need for people to be concerned about their spiritual and moral development. And it'll be through that prejudices will be diminished and eliminated. So I think when we talk about, in my mind, a world without war doesn't necessarily imply a world without conflict. Mm-hmm. But it envisages the emergence of a culture where prejudices will progressively reduce and the barriers to peace will be diminished. Mm.
Nason, I'd like to also add to this. It's such an important question about whether we're innately violent, and therefore always going to have to go to war. It's an age-old question, as you know. I mean, I'll bring it up to Rousseau and Hobbes. Rousseau basically said, look, a human being is innocent until society corrupts him or her, right? And Hobbes was the opposite, that people are competitive, they're aggressive, they're violent, and they will do whatever they can for their own benefit, for their own well-being. So it's a long argument that's been going on for a long time. Now, it's interesting to me that in the 1980s, there's a group that got together in Spain, and they wrote a statement called the Seville Statement. Mm. And it's a very interesting statement. You can Google this, it'll come right up. This was a very interesting interdisciplinary group of people, scholars, who basically concluded in their statement that we've looked at human nature biologically, psychologically, sociologically, historically, from every angle possible, anthropologically, and we have concluded that violence is not an innate, an inherited quality that a human being has. And this ties into the Baha'i spiritual principle of human nature, that yes, we can be just as nasty as can be, which is our baser side, which is our lower side. But through spiritual education, through an understanding of the spiritual realm, which has to do with values and morals, we can begin to overcome that more dark side that each of us can have. That's the interesting thing. Every one of us has the capacity for either direction. So we know this, and I think more and more people today understand this and probably agree with this. But the problem is what we see around us is more conflict and more war. We haven't diminished in this area. And I think part of the reason is that generally, if we look at wars, they are either based on greed or fear or some form of ideology. And the struggle is one of power struggle over the other, one over the other. And spiritual education is really what raises the human consciousness to appreciate that there are alternatives to just warring and taking over another society or another group or plundering or whatever, for greed, for, as I said, for fear or for ideology. Now, having said that, I also believe that we need to study war. We need to understand war. We need to understand it in order to know what to do about it and how to alleviate it. And I think this is a very important way of looking at human nature, because when you talk to veterans of many wars, eventually it comes out that although they were happy, especially World War II, I would say, happy that they were able to be on the right side of history, that the damage that was done to their own psyche during this war is something that they live with forever, So I think the spiritual nature of ourselves is extremely important to cultivate, educate, and develop, but also to understand war, why we do this.
Right. Do you think, like, for example, I think a lot of people are a little bit blind to war right now. I think there's conflicts right now, Armenia, Azerbaijan, there's Syria still is happening, Afghanistan, I think there's a lot of things happening still, but for the most part, and a lot of this is, maybe you could blame media, the news and media for this. Everybody's focused on the pandemic right now, so a lot of things aren't being covered, and things aren't always. I used to work for CNN, and there was a lot of things we didn't cover sometimes just because we couldn't get people there, for example, But do you think there's a blind spot, I guess, is what I want to know, in society, where it's kind of like, unless it's affecting them, they don't want to think about it. They don't want to worry about it. And they see war in a very kind of tangible way, the way, you were explaining. They're not looking at it as it's possible for everybody to go to war if we don't work on our own selves, our spirituality, our prejudices. So when they think of this war going on in another country, they think, well, that's because of X, Y, and Z, but we don't have that problem. Do you think there's a danger to that? Like, are there any statistics even? Do we know, is it easy for a country to go to war or for conflict to erupt, even in places where you wouldn't assume?
Nason, I agree that maybe in some of the Western countries, war is not present. It's not right in our faces. Okay, fine. But if you just take the issue of inequalities in the Western nations, that is a war in and of itself.
Right.
You have a group, for the reasons of greed, power, ideology, whatever, who maintain a status quo, and you have the larger segment of the population suffering enormously because of the inequalities that exist in our Western countries, I would say. And so I think it's how we define war,
It's not necessarily fighter planes and
not just weaponry, right? It's other forms of weapons, including economic. Yes.
Just picking up on that, I think not only is it important to broaden one's perspective of what constitutes war, but I think but I think that the same thing is necessary in relation to peace. And I think bringing it back to the tablets to The Hague and a Baha'i perspective on peace, clearly peace needs a universal framework. It's not just enough to sign a treaty, but you won't have war if you continue to have racism, if you have violence against women, if you have inequality, if you don't have this, that, and the other. So there's a need. I think one of the contributions of the tablet is that they're reminders of what's important if we're going to lay the foundation for a different kind of a world. Allied with that is, how do you engage people in this process of thinking more broadly and then acting on their understanding of the enlarged context? You know, Abdu'l talks about the power of implementation, and in relation to the response of the executive committees when they wrote to Abdu'l in response to his first letter, they, as Hoda said, it was very, very cordial. They focused on the things that they shared with the faith, the importance of peace and the importance of working for peace, but they couldn't relate to the role of religion. Mm. They said, we're pacifists. There are differences among pacifists about the importance of religion. Well, Abdu'l-Baha's response was, to write again with a second letter, and he underlined the things they had in common, praised them for their conscientious efforts in working for peace, and pointed out the importance of implementation. Mm. It's not enough just to have an intellectual view of peace, that has to be put into practice. And he called upon them to think about ways of harnessing the power of implementation. And then he said, we Baha'is do it this way. And he stressed the importance of of religion to social development, cultural development, the rise of civilization and the like. So it was an exchange of ideas pointing to what the faith had in common with this organization, but then also saying, there are many ways, and this is the way we do it.
Right. Yeah, this is a difficult one because, as we know, in the Baha'i writings, Baha'u'llah says that if religion causes disunity, it's better not to have it at all. On the other hand, as Baha'is, we're charged with working to actively engaging in our society and working towards, serving others and creating unity. And hand in hand with people, whether they're Baha'i or not, whether they're religious or not. Does religion really play a role today, do you think, still? Or is it those spiritual principles that all religions, like the foundation of all the religions share, that plays the role right now? Is it better right now to not worry about religion and just focus on those spiritual principles that, Abdu'l talked about, and, ridding ourselves of racism and serving others? What do we, because we see a lot of the conflict is religious, for example.
Well, that's a very good question. And I want to start out by saying that, again, I'm speaking from the lens of the Baha'i faith, and also perhaps all other religions, if I may. which is the purpose of creation, the purpose of life. And basically, we are told that there is this unknowable essence called God, which the human mind can never fathom, and that God has brought creation into being. And it's interesting, brought creation into being out of love for humanity and for creation. So there's the key word, love. And that just as we need physics to understand the universe and its laws, we also need religion to understand the spiritual nature of this creation created by God. Therefore, from the very beginning of what we historically have record of, because I don't think, Abraham and Judaism was the first of the prophets, but we just don't have records of the previous ones. But from the outset, and Baha'u'llah teaches this in terms of the social evolution of religion, which he calls progressive revelation. He says, all religions are equal, and they all come from the one single source, which is God. Therefore, to assume that these religions come into the world so they can begin to war with each other is really ludicrous. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. But that we have different names for religions and different names for their prophet founders is because they come with laws, both spiritual and social, that are relevant for the age in which that religion appears. So this social evolution of religion is extremely important, but it means that religion is not static. It is always in motion, and it is always changing. Even as we speak, the Baha'i faith is the same. It is always going to change because that's the nature of this creation that we live in. So from that lens, whether a person is Baha'i or not is really, for a Baha'i, I think, not entirely relevant. If I may, this is a personal opinion, but I don't think it's relevant because Baha'u'llah says that there is no other in this religion. In fact, he totally removes the concept of infidel and says there's no other. It's us. It's only us and nothing else at this age, at this time. That's why his principle of the oneness of humankind and the oneness of the nations, because that's where this planet has come to at this point. So having said that, I would say that religion is very much an important institution because that's where we learn the sacredness of human life, the dignity that belongs to every human being. That's where we learn wrong from right. And I think that's where all of these, I call them spiritual, but they are a moral, ethical framework that emerges, which says, I need to look to myself to see if I'm responding to this love for which I was created for, which is asking me in this age to be loving of everyone, to be kind to everyone, to, work with people in order to see if we can change the darkness of this world into the light that I think we all deserve. Whether a person is a Baha'i or not, it doesn't matter. We can work together to bring about these principles and these teachings.
So what do you both hope then that people will take away from your book and from Abdu'l Baha's letters?
There are several things that I think are useful to reflect on from our book. And one is the idea of, if you will, seizing the moment. And by that I mean that there are certain times when events in the world really stir up people People suffer. They're forced to examine their assumptions about things, and the like. And I think the period of the leading up to the First World War and the outcome of the First World War, when Abdu'l-Baha was writing these letters, was one such period. And I think the present day, the COVID period, seems to be a similar a similar kind of time where things are stirred up. I mean, people, and when it first started, talked about desiring things to go back to normal. Now, a lot of the discussion is saying, hey, do we really want them to go back to normal? That won't take care of this problem and that problem and the other problem. So maybe we need to think more deeply about this. That's one aspect of the book. There's time for really reflecting deeply, and also being aware that problems, even after you've thought about them deeply, are not automatically solved. We have to reflect again in the light of the new circumstances. So it's important as human beings to be aware of what's happening in the world. We have to have a historical sense rather than just watch the news, which changes so quickly every day. There needs to be a sense of history in our perspective on many of the issues that confront society, one of which is war and the resolution of war and the building of a peaceful world. So I guess that's the thing that I've been thinking about in relation to the book.
Nason, if I may, I think picking up on what Janet said, one of the things that for me stood out once we wrote this book is Abdu'l-Baha's persistence.
Yeah.
Look, the turn of the century, 1900, was a very exciting time, very similar actually to today. Globalization in that context was taking place, communication, transportation, you name it. Amazing creativity in the arts and sciences, discoveries, inventions. It was an amazing time of, again, change. And the empires of that time, Europe was in its heyday. I mean, no one thought in 1900 that within a decade, a little bit over a decade, that continent would experience what it went through with the war. No one. I think similar to today, we have all kinds of changes that are taking place in society. One of the most difficult one, I think, is technology and social media, newspapers, all kinds of media, in spreading falsehood, in spreading divisions, in spreading ideas that are, falsely grounded, and in making us think through the algorithms that this is what we want to hear, rather than I need to get out there and search what I want to know about, rather than what is being fed to me, which is a very dangerous thing. So I say all of this because Abdu'l-Baha surveyed the world. He knew what was happening. He repeatedly said during his travels in the West, look, war is around the corner. Everyone is preparing for it. And it was true. I mean, there's never been so many uniforms seen on the streets of Europe than it was during the early 1900s. So he knew what was going on. But what he did was continually present a different view, new ideas, new principles, new perspective, hopeful ideas, ideas that everyone could adopt and work with. And I think for me, this was really the lesson, that even if you're not listened to, even if you're not heard, you still need to put these ideas out there, because somewhere a spark will occur and someone will pick up on it. I think some of the greatest endeavors in the world have started this way, with very few people, but eventually it builds up. And to just one last thing, the Baha'i view of peace is really, it really starts with one's inward life. It's a very individual thing at some level. Baha'u'llah tells us, before we go out telling others what to do, turn inward and get your own house in order, you know? And I think that's a very important lesson these days, where there's so much shouting and you know, accusations against each other taking place, that it's better to look at one's inward life and to say, what is it that I can do to bring hope, to bring happiness, to bring a different perspective about what we human beings are capable of achieving. I think this is what I take away from Abdu'l-Baha's example and the tablets that he wrote, which are so full of vital, helpful information.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. I'm going to leave a link in the description for the book as well. I'm really excited about this. Thank you for sharing. The book is A World Without War, Abdu'l Baha and the Discourse for Global Peace. Thank you, Professor Hoda Mahmoudi. Thank you, Dr. Janet Khan. This has been such a wonderful hour that you've given me. I really appreciate it. I'm very excited about this book as well. And I hope more and more people read this. And I was really blown away by this concept of, you know, I think even I fall victim to this concept of things being just tangible. If you think of war, you only think of, like, you know, bullets and, you know, fighter planes, and not really the war within a society that's under the surface. So this has been really, really fascinating. Thank you so much, both of you, for your time, and very excited about this. And thank you for this wonderful contribution of the book to humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Nason.
Thank you, Nason.